Well, welcome to the special meeting of Council Orientation tonight on December 19th. We'll get the meeting going and we'll call to order. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest tonight? Seeing none, we'll go right down to the orientation presentations, and we'll start with the strategic plan. And I believe Michael Graves is going to present that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll start with the first few slide presentations tonight, and then we'll have some of our department heads take over thereafter. But for the first few, we're going on that. We'll start with the main one right up is the strategic plan. I assume that most of you have read the strategic plan, and a lot of the words that are in here are just an exact copy of the strategic plan. I didn't bring forward this slide deck really in an effort to talk about those particular words unless council has some discussion about some of those, and if they'd like to make some minor changes or something, we could talk about that. But the real thing that I was bringing this forward to talk about is the action plan, which is right near the end of this. So if I'm moving too fast, or if somebody'd like to talk about some of the wording in here, feel free to speak up and we can talk about some of the parts of the strategic plan. Anything that anybody like to highlight in here? Okay, I'll move right to the action plan. So the strategic plan was adopted last year, or in the early part of the year, and we, of course, worked for a long time with community input to try to discuss what it should look like. But one of the key drivers of it is the actual action plan, and as you can see here, there's a bunch of council priorities. Improve internal and external communication, complete the secondary plan, develop the Merck multi-use recreation center, increase our commercial base, implement the recreation master plan, and support the long-term viability of Alexandria Hospital, improve the diversity and affordability of housing in Ingersoll. So that's really what I was intending to talk about this slide deck presentation. And we've included in here a extra column that it was not in the original strategic plan, and it's a time frame. So a number of these policies and action items we have already begun to work on. We haven't brought them forward because we wanted to see what would happen in the election and if there was any additional things that, ideas that would come out of those out of the election that might be included in the policy, and we have seen some of those things that will change. So I'm going to start with the improve internal and external communication. One of the first items is the launch a town email newsletter for residents. So I think that's one of the things we've heard from council, and we heard during election, more communication would be beneficial. So what that looks like will probably come forward in a report. I'm anticipating that'll be the fall of next year. We've got a number of other council policies and reports that we'll be bringing forward. And we don't want to overwhelm council, and we don't want to sell any of the policies short by doubling up or tripling up of policies in one meeting. We would like each policy to kind of be well considered and to go through that process. So we'll probably, for the next few months, be bringing forward almost a policy every meeting for council to consider. So that's one that's probably going to wait until the fall, and we can talk together about what that will look like, what kind of information items we should include on that, and what a distribution would look like, both through all sources of media, whether it be social media, electronic media, or even print, and what that would look like. So expect a report later in the fall for that to look at, and for council to consider what to do and how to create an email newsletter. Create a volunteer policy. We have this policy already drafted, and we're ready to bring it forward, so it will be one of the first ones that comes forward. It'll come forward in a fulsome report. So I wrote it down for spring of 2023, but it's pretty well ready to go. We worked with our insurance company to look at best practices and what a policy would look like for that. And I think it's important that we start to wrap our heads around that, especially as we may need some of the mandates that we put out to our committees may involve volunteers. So it's good for council to know what they can expect out of their volunteers and what they can expect to be able to get them to do. And as I'm going through any of these, if there's any questions out through you, your worship, that you could let me know or ask them as they come up. Under improve internal, external communications, one of the things was implement a 360 employee feedback process. That process has begun. We actually did that earlier this year, and some on council will recall that they did them for myself and the department heads. And we got very good feedback, and we've made some adjustments in some areas, and we're able to capitalize on some other areas. So that's something that we've already begun and will continue next year. We did a rather broad 360 review for myself. So next year would probably be a little more limited, but it would certainly be something that council, stakeholders, and hopefully some members of the public, that's what we got last time, was council, stakeholders, agencies, colleagues, and some members of the public participated in the 360 reviews. Although I don't know the particular individuals that participated, we did get good feedback, I could say for myself personally, and I think the department heads as well. So that's something we will continue. The next one is celebrate innovative staff suggestions, and I think that's one thing that is more of a broad issue on how to celebrate staff, really. And I'm hearing more and more, and as council will be aware, the public is hearing more and more, it's difficult to get good employees. We're very lucky to have a very fantastic team here and very good employees. We'd like to keep them. And we'd like to encourage more and start getting more younger people. So Human Resources have developed a report that has some items on it on how to encourage new applicants and high-grade applicants. One of the items in that, of course, is our pay equity grid and our comparators. We just did our pay equity grid, re-updated it, and we're staying on top of that. Council will recall we moved to the P50 in 1 year, and then the year after we went to P60. So we are not the leading edge of wage payers, but we are definitely within the game. We are definitely competitive. And that's a component of an employee strategy, but a broader strategy involving a number of things like benefits and how work is done and all those things is something that's being considered in that report. And that report is basically ready to go too, so that will be coming, I think we wrote it down again, spring 2023. That will be coming very quickly to council in the new year to look at some options there. And it may be one of those things where council looks at some of them and says, this year let's adopt these three, and next year let's consider these other three, or reanalyze at that point. So that report is coming forward. Does that make sense? Complete the secondary plan is the next one, and of course council will know that we've already hired a planning consultant as per the budget, and we are working through that process. We've been getting public input. We got a couple of good public inputs in the last few days, been getting, and that'll be coming forward again in spring for more review, and with hopeful completion that'll be completed sometime next year, probably mid to late next year by the time the secondary plan is there. And that talks about designating and zoning new residential lands, and that's really dependent on that secondary plan and what the planning consultants say through that process of what should be designated and where it should be designated. So that will come forward. The next part of it is develop the MERC. One of the items in there is confirmed plan to ensure that the town is eligible for funding from senior levels of government. One of the slide decks that we'll be touching on here shortly is the MERC, where we're just sort of talking high level about the issues with the multi-use recreation facility. So I won't get into it too much at this presentation, but I will say that we are looking at pricing and options in order to make the facility more green, because we see a lot of the funding is contingent on that. So we're trying to figure out what we can do to make that facility more environmentally friendly, because a lot of the funding seems to be pushing in that direction. So to make us more eligible for funding, we've begun to gather some of that information. The next items is negotiate usage agreements for residents of adjacent municipalities and secure funding. Those will all be discussed, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the MERC slide deck, but it's something that we're going to have to try to wrap our heads around. And again, probably at some point in the new year, in the very early in the new year, talk about which direction we'd like to go in to pursue for the MERC. So today we're trying to plant the seed to say, we want you to think about these issues. You don't have to make any big decisions today, but start to think about these, especially as we head into budget season. So on those particular ones, we haven't put a whole lot of timeframes because a lot of that's dependent on what council, how quickly council would like to go and which options we start to pursue. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, thank you. A few head nods, so I'm like. The next one is increase our commercial base, and a lot of this has to do with the reviewing our housing strategy as well. So we plan to review our community improvement plan and policy and budget, engage development stakeholders and evaluate feedback, identify areas of improvement, encourage more commercial development. So that's one of the things we'll be bringing forward to council as well, probably more like the summer, once we get through a couple of our other policies, to talk about, are there ways, you already have a community improvement plan, and a community improvement plan is a plan that designates certain areas that you want certain types of growth, say like your downtown is typically where community improvement plans are used, and you incentivize certain types of upgrades or potential investments in those areas. So an example would be upper story residential. We need more housing, and one way to support our downtown is to have commercial on the ground floor and residential on the upper floors. Council already offers community improvement plan for the upper stories to build more residential. It's currently offering low interest loans and some grant, but council may want to put more money into that and incentivize more in order to encourage that even more. We haven't had a whole lot of uptake on it, so that might be something that they want to look at. So that is a big part of that process that we'll likely be considering on summer. Sorry, Irina, did you have something? No, okay.
No, sorry, Mr. Shea, I will just, can you touch on the difference between CIP and bonusing and how we use that as an effective tool?
Yeah, so the community improvement plan is a very detailed plan that you have to go through. It's a planning document that has to get approval by the province, and you are able to set up certain districts of what you'd like to accomplish, and you have to be very clear about how you will provide funding and what that type of funding is intended to do, like what you're trying to accomplish. Like in the upper story residential is a good example. You would say, as a council, we're trying to get more residential in the downtown. We're trying to provide another financial resource for the businesses downtown, and we're trying to provide redevelopment so the buildings are upgraded and restored and so on. So through that program, we offer an incentivization, and these are some of the tools that we use to do that. So it's got to be very specific, and it's got to be very detailed, and that plan has to go through, as I say, and actually get approved by the province. So it's quite a lengthy process. Luckily, we already have one in place. To modify it slightly is not a big deal, but to recreate one is quite a big deal. So it takes several months, if not a couple of years, to actually get that approved in full process. So luckily, we already have one, and that will, I think, help us on a number of fronts in what we're trying to incentivize. Does that explain that? Well, is that what you're after?
Yeah, maybe I'll just expand a little bit. I just want council to know, we can't, we're trying to get businesses to come here and stuff. We can't bonus them. So we can't say individual business, like business A, okay, we'll give you no taxes for 10 years. It has to be across the board, and that's where the CIP comes in. We have tax incremental grants where taxes are phased in over a certain amount of time if they meet certain criteria, which helps all businesses. It has to be, all businesses have to be treated the same. So again, that goes to help that, and it's throughout, that portion is throughout the whole town, I believe. And so there's a lot of rules and regulations. The United States is a lot different, and so they like to play a lot of games, and you'll hear about all the great incentives for companies and stuff. We just can't do that in Ontario, and so, but this is a tool we can use to help businesses relocate here and be fair about it.
That's right, and it is sort of evenly across the board. Provided we do offer it for some of our industrial clients to have an assessment rebate program that they invest in. They can get, it would be like a sliding scale where basically they would pay taxes up front, but the first year they would get 90% back of our portion, then 80% back, and so on the premise that they won't then appeal their taxes, because we've had some large industries that I won't name that have appealed their taxes, and we end up probably in the same place, but it's almost, and it's the carrot rather than the stick. So you're trying to incentivize them to invest, and it's actually easier for them as well, because then it solidifies, here's how much you're going to pay. They don't have to pay a bunch of consultants a whole bunch of money to appeal their assessment and so on. So that's one methodology that we use as well through the community improvement plan.
Yep, Councilor Halleran.
This is the same as what we saw happen in Mississauga, where Hazel McKinnon was able to attract a lot of all the companies and kind of clean Scarborough and, and Toronto out. And then all of a sudden, we wondered what happened, and it was this kind of program. Is that the kind of?
Yeah, they're used quite a bit across Ontario for some specific districts. Sometimes they'll use them in heritage districts and different types of things that you're trying to incentivize. Not everybody uses them though, and I've had pretty extensive experience using them in Tillsonburg and Norwich, and now in Ingersoll. We've had great success with it in the downtown in Tillsonburg, and so we're hopeful to do that here too. But yeah, not everybody does implement them, so.
Would it be something that we implement per business or across, like Brian is saying, would it be like for downtown, or would it be just for industrial, or would it be for landlords to build? Or would it be a general or specific?
Essentially, the programs are aimed at sort of types of business, right? Downtown, industrial, you aim more at target industries type than what you're trying to incentivize. So,
Okay.
and we can go through that when we bring forward those strategies and explain more about what the community improvement plan is. It's a very important tool. It's been around since the late 70s, and but not a lot of people have used them even to this day. So it works very well because it does allow council to do some incentives. So.
Thank you, Mayor Petrie. Michael, I think this is something that, I know you said we haven't had a lot of uptick on it, and we have had it out there for about 3 years. I think when we go back to our communications, I think this needs to be a big portion of it, because I don't think a lot of the businesses downtown either A, understand it, or know it's available.
That's right. Yeah. And again, as we implement more communication and even things like newsletters, it can be a key thing to put out there, because it is a very important tool that can help businesses get to where they need to go. Okay. So yeah, through that process and that evaluation, then we'll identify areas of improvement and encourage more commercial development, some of those ways, some of those tools. So the next one is implement the recreation master plan, and a couple of the steps along there is engage the trail stakeholders and develop more trails. We have actually drafted a new trail vision, and we've actually had the trail committee has seen the trail vision, I believe, and started to look at it, and it's a report that's ready to go, and we'll bring forward to council. It involves a number of new trails through some various opportunities, some of which has come up because of types of development where we've asked for trails to be a part of our parkland dedication. Some of it has come up as a party to agreements. We now believe the County of Oxford will enter into some agreements for their land, for us to have trails across it, and Upper Thames as well has indicated an interest in doing that. So there's a number of areas that we've wanted to develop as trails for a long time. We believe we have the opportunity to do that now. The first step is sort of creating a trails vision, and then establishing, yes, that's what council wants, and then mandating to the committee to assist us in getting to the place where, which trails do we focus on first, and where do we go from there. There's one property that the Kiwanis has taken over that will connect to a bunch of trails, and they'll be coming forward because I think they want that to be transferred into the town's ownership now. So that will be coming as well. So it's pretty comprehensive, and I think council will appreciate looking at it. So that's coming very shortly.
And if I could, just being on the Trails Committee, I can say that the Trails Committee, we've had some amazing members on there. Our chair, Mike, was instrumental in the Beachville Trail being developed. He's since moved to town, and so he's been out spotting and worked with Kyle and Upper Thames to be able to really map out some really, if everything comes to fruition, wow, Ingersoll is going to be a leader in some really usable trail network that could really connect the town. So that is an exciting thing. yeah, there is some ownership issues, especially with the north side of the Thames River. There's some private ownership things there, but I think we can work through it, and once we get that going, it'd be time to, but there'd be some budget implications for sure. If we want more trails, they're gonna cost money to develop, so something to think about for budget time.
And it can probably be an item where council can say, we want to establish X number of meters or kilometers of trail per year, and so we'll put the X number of dollars in every year, and every year just progressively get better with more trails, once we have the trail vision adopted by council, so that is coming. The next one is plant more trees. We actually have developed a new tree planting policy with the express intent of planting more trees, and that is another policy that's ready to go and we'll bring to council, and it's going to be looking at a number of areas where we plant trees, making requirements on developers if they cut down trees to replace 3 to 1, making requirements on ourselves if we do engineering projects that widen a street and remove trees, we plant 3 to 1. Also continuing our tree program where we give out trees, but maybe expanding it and creating some areas in town that will be more naturalized and allow to plant more trees. Those overflow trees can go to more naturalized areas, so it'll look something like that. You'll see that very shortly. So that one will be coming too. Any questions on that? I'll move on to support the long-term viability of Alexandria Hospital. Engaging the hospital and other stakeholders, creating a plan for municipal support for the hospital. And we had talked about developing a committee and establishing what that might look like to support the hospital. But that's something I think we need to discuss with council as to where they would like to go with that. We also now know of a couple other opportunities that might be coming that will support the hospital as well. So, and working closely with their CEO on what can be done to support them. So that particular one, we haven't put specific times to. It might be good to have Nadia come and speak to council early in the term and have her get updated. As we know, they just got significant funding and they're making a pretty sizable investment in the facility. And we know there may be some other investments in the near area that may support them as well. So that might be the first step, is getting Nadia to come here and speak to council and advise on what they're doing and what they could utilize, and then council can kind of decide a direction from there. There's no questions on that one. The next one is improve the diversity and affordability of housing in Ingersoll. Again, this one is something that could be done through a committee. Engaging Oxford County and housing stakeholders, developing a housing strategy, including streamlining planning processes, adapting the community improvement plan incentives, and so on. So again, we've begun to work on a policy, sort of a housing strategy policy. It is not as far along as some of the other policies, but it would again involve probably maximization of the community improvement plan. And we were also looking at the potential for secondary units in residential houses, and then Doug Ford stole our thunder and changed the laws. So that may become as of right. I haven't seen the regulations. I was looking just today to see if those regulations have come out, but they're saying they're going to become as of right. So what that will look like, they may mandate for us that secondary units in houses and potentially even sort of tiny homes in backyards and things may be allowed. So we're waiting to see those regulations and what that will look like. That may take over some of what we were going to do, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. So, but that report will encompass those things and what council can do to incentivize the different types of housing that they will want as well. So when this was adopted, this was the direction from council, to saying this is our vision, this is our belief in what the future should be for the community. Staff went away and started working on these policies to implement that vision. And we're prepared to start bringing those policies forward for council to look at. And barring council telling me not to, I will just continue and bring those forward. So.
Yeah, and I'll speak to that process. This followed the 2014 strategic plan, which was pretty successful because we have the action plan. It gave staff the ability to say, okay, these are clear goals that council wants us to achieve, and we were very successful with achieving at least 90% of,
Goals, yeah, that's right.
a lot of those, whether it was stop the landfill, create a dog park, and many others, so it was good. So this is good to see again, they're clear objectives. Think about them. Obviously, the strategic plan is in place now, but it's an important thing to go through as we go through budget. Make sure it aligns with this council's goals, with the community's goals. There was a lot of community stakes, input on them. That stuff's all on the website, the full version, so make sure if you haven't to go through everything, and it gives you the background for it, and then we can move forward. The best thing we can do is provide clear direction to staff, and they can give us exactly what we're looking for in the end, and the community, and then we can, again, if this one gets done real fast, we can just do another one.
Yeah.
So
We don't
there's,
mind,
there's always something to do, but again, there's only so much staff time, there's only so much resources. So the more we can provide clear direction on exactly what needs to be achieved, then it's a better chance it's going to get achieved, and we can move the town forward in a direction that the citizens want us to.
And as you can see by this timeline, we feel we've made good progress already, and we're ready to bring a lot of things forward to council, and that should move us through a little quicker than we actually expected. But we know there's a number of other things that want to be accomplished, so it's good to get these done and move on to the next thing. So staff like goals, so if the council's agreeable to these goals, we'll keep working away at them, so.
Oh, go ahead, sorry. I thought you
Thank you, no problem. Through you, Mayor.
just, tonight's a little less formal. If you have a question, just go ahead and ask it, and then as long as we're just not talking over each other.
That helps, thank you. Through you, just a couple of questions. My first one has to do with the housing strategy that's at the end there. It has the timing as long-term, and keeping in mind that there's a lot of stuff to be done. It feels like the longer we push something like that down the road, it's going to be harder to address. So I'm just wondering if there's any way to move it up, or if the Oxford County housing strategy helps us move that along, maybe just your sense of if that timing could be more urgent.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the Oxford County Housing Strategy does help us, so that's good. And even, as I said, what Doug Ford has done recently helps us, because that is just work that we were intending to do, now he's done. If those regulations come out the right way, that should help us. So that kind of takes away two key components. When I didn't write the part of the timing that says long-term on that, the consultants did that. And some of the items you'll see in here kind of say medium-term, and whereas we're almost ready with those policies already. So I think, and that's one of the key things, is that I think we can get a lot of this done a lot quicker than we expected, but we don't want to overwhelm council either. It's a new council, we've got budgets, we've got a bunch of other things, and as I say, I don't want to, if I brought forward a trails vision and a new trees policy and a volunteer policy all at the same meeting, I don't think we would give it as good a consideration, and I need council's input to make sure that that policy is the best policy that can be. Staff think we've done a good job, but we need better input from council and from stakeholders. So I like to bring those forward sort of one at a time. Expect there will be one of them on the agenda on January, and probably February, probably March. So if we move through those relatively quickly, I think that will get us down to the housing strategy a little quicker. As I say, we've already begun to do some homework on that. We've done a fair bit of homework on secondary units, and now that's kind of out. But we will keep working on that as we move forward. So I expect that to be in front of council at some point next year. It's just a matter of how long. So that long term, in my mind, and I should say, depending on what you're trying to incentivize, and I don't, it's not like we're going to pass a policy next year and then go, okay, that's done. In some cases, let's say like a tree policy, if we come up with a policy and say, let's plant more trees, this is a policy, it may well be done. It may be, okay, do that, just keep doing it, and then we can look at it in a couple of years and see if it's working and see if that's anticipating. But the housing strategy will be one that we will work on probably almost every year to look at how do we refine this, is it working, how it's not going to be a problem that's going to be solved next year. So, but we will have some specific areas that will be improved, and rather quickly, and that will move through rather quickly. An example, like the secondary units, if they put that, they codify that and say municipal zoning bylaws don't pertain and you've got to allow these, that may help bring more units into the program. At the same time, it may create public animosity, it may create individuals, so there will be growing pains through that process. So we'll have to see how that plays out, but I expect it to be sort of a short-term and a long-term one, because it's going to be one that we're going to be doing for a number of years.
Yeah, Michael, thank you. When I viewed the long term, I didn't see it as that's when we're going to do it. I viewed it the same as what you just explained. It's going to be an ongoing type of policy. It's going to be something that's always going to be evolving. We're seeing the county making changes. We're seeing the province making changes. We have to deal with the collateral. So I see it as something that's going to be taking a long-term role and until we get it figured out, if we ever do.
Yeah.
It's important for council to think about these for a housing strategy. What do you envision that to encompass, and share that with staff? So when they bring for a policy, it's something that it encompasses what we're all trying to work towards. Is it policy driven, where we just look at our zoning bylaws and stuff like that to see what's happening? Is it from a strategic land use policy? Is it from incentivizing policy? There's so many different things to housing to think about. The county's housing strategic policy was mostly on the affordable housing side and what was available to fund that sort of thing. That's not our game here. Unfortunately, that's an upper tier municipality responsibility. So that may not be a component of ours, but how do we work with the county to make sure that we're available? So just think about these things over time, and if you have ideas or questions, make sure you reach out to staff and they can clarify what they're kind of thinking. Is it what type of housing are we trying to, employment housing, retirement housing? There's so many different things in housing, so it's important that you share your ideas so staff are again, not just using their own ideas, but they're incorporating everyone's as well, and they can't do that unless we share them.
Maria, I just wondered, because of time and the fact that we're actually talking about developing the strategy, at what point are we able to share as council what we've heard, kind of come together, galvanize what we have heard in common from what people need, so that then we can present it to staff? Like, is it an individual thing that you share your ideas at a time, or are we coming together to have a wholesome strategy of these are the kind of variety that we're talking about and looking at, and then present it to staff?
Well, I think the earlier you can share any ideas and what you'd like to see incorporated into the strategy with staff, that's I would do that as soon as possible, as soon as you come with it. That gives them time to do research and see if they can incorporate that and how it'd work. You can always have discussions with council, obviously not full council, but individual councilors about what you're thinking around that to see if there's a consensus there. The more consensus we have, it's easier for staff to go in that direction and incorporate that into the plan. But again, I think during budget time, we'll have some discussions on it. And as we get closer into that plan, if staff needs direction, if they're at a roadblock, they can always come to council as well and say, hey, we're thinking about this, but what is the actual direction you're going to want to see in this housing strategy on this section of it?
So what I'm confused about is it means that we're not, as council, while we're in council, able to discuss options and variety, so that they're here and
Yeah, and I could, as we bring forward a report for council to consider, then definitely council can discuss that. But you all have just gone through an election, and one of the great things about elections is you get a lot of feedback from the community. So feel free to pass that feedback on to staff. We think we've done some stuff to already identify what we think some of the needs are. And, but we would certainly appreciate that input, and then hopefully we can at least have considered that in a report that we brought forward. If something was, you know, I don't know, I can't think of a great example, but, you know, we want to build a 42 stories tower or something and build it for the municipality and they'll fund it. Staff might say, well, we really can't afford that, and here's why, but we would at least consider it in the report so council can look at the reasons why and what may be done. But there may be other things like the council may say, what would it take to allow tiny homes? And staff can identify what those steps would be and what that can be. So if you tell that to staff individually now, expect that to be included in the report, either what it would take, the practicality, and what the recommendations are, but at least it would give the council something to consider.
So forgive me, that's what I'm asking. You want council to give you recommendations, correct?
Yeah.
So my question is, at what point does council come up with a unified front? Or is it individually we just keep sending? Because I'm looking at a sense of time and understanding of the whole concept of what we're thinking. I think I'm losing a sense that we don't get to sit and discuss what we're all talking about, but then staff gets all of that in bits and bits. And I'm wondering at what point do we, because once we leave here, it becomes a council meeting if you have more than 3 people, right? So when are we taking advantage of having?
Well, we could always have a special meeting where we just discuss a topic, and there's no problem with that whatsoever. If council wants to, if there's different items on the strategic plan or any other item, we can, if there's a consensus on council that we want to have a meeting to talk about that, that's certainly something that staff can arrange, and that I'd like to give them a little bit of time so they can do some research. And again, that's if you provide individuals with ideas, and then staff can have some information around those ideas so we can have an informed discussion about the topic. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with giving staff some input that way.
And typically what would happen is if council was interested in an area and I was trying to think of some weird example, but you know, if council thought we really want to build a rocket ship, and so they might say, Michael, pass a resolution, Michael, write a report, what it would take to make a rocket ship. And then we would go away and write that report, and we'd bring it back. And that would be the point that council kind of talks about, you know, okay, is this practical? What does it look like? So it's the same thing with the housing strategy. And any of these ones on here that you see now, if there's any ones that council would like me to bring up first or sort of prioritize, we can. But at the same time, knowing that there's quite a list here, and there's, like I say, we can't overwhelm you, and we can't be overwhelmed ourselves, so it's a matter of taking some of that forward. Right now, because of what Doug Ford's announced with some of his stuff, and what we've seen in the past, and not to be judgmental of Doug Ford, but what we've seen in the past is that sometimes what they announce and sometimes what comes out in the regulations are not the same. So we'd like to see those regulations so that we know what that means, so that we can say to you, because if they do allow secondary units as of right, that may change a big component of the housing strategy really quickly. And so a big part of our plan that we'd already worked on was that secondary unit plan. So, you know, if they become the law and they override us, that law's out. So then we'd almost like to see that come to fruition and then try to identify, okay, what does that leave us with and what do we want to incentivize otherwise? So my thought would be that this policy would come more like sort of summer, fall of next year. And some of the other ones that are more obvious and relatively straightforward and where we're not going to be in competition with the province, we would bring them forward in the new year rather quickly so that you could look at them. But it's really a matter of timing. And if council says, no, Michael, we want you to focus on building a spaceship right now, then a rocket ship right now, then I'll get on that. So.
I have a quick question, Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yep, go ahead, and then we'll have Deputy Mayor.
Okay, I apologize, sorry. I couldn't see anybody else have their hand up, I apologize. Michael, when the strategic plan came into effect, the consultants based some of the priorities upon what the community itself felt were priorities as well, did they not? I mean, how you've strategized and what's coming before council and when it's coming before council was also put out there by the community and the stakeholders when they talked to the consultants and brought forward their ideas. Am I not correct on that?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay, so I think that how everything is coming to us is well laid out. I would like to see us have a discussion as we're able to in regards to the housing in that respect, because obviously there's some around the council table that would like to do that. However, I also don't want to see our staff get overwhelmed to the point where they are not able to bring forward what they have been working on and need to bring forward. So I just caution council that how much we bring forward may slow down some of the other stuff that staff has been working on. And we were told by the consultants that this was a priority within our community as well. So I think that they're following consultants' suggestions. But as we're able to bring forward other things, then I think that we should. I have no problem with having an extra council meeting if that's what we need to have those fulsome discussions and really work at that. But I just wanted to bring forward that point. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Was similar to Councillor Van Kooten-Bostens in that I am very conscious of the capacity of staff and not wanting to burn anyone out, because this isn't even including the community master plan and all sorts of other things that need to be done. So through the budget process, I would encourage staff to be very honest about what is realistic given the staff we have, or if we need more capacity. Because if we're saying this is what needs to be done, but we don't have the staffing resources to do it, then that's a conversation that I think council should be open to hearing.
And that's a very good point in that if we need things faster, it may involve more resources. So that's something we'd have to identify. So.
Excellent. Are there any further questions on the strategic plan?
Sorry, I just want to add one more thing,
absolutely.
if I may. So under the economic development pillar, it talks a lot about commercial, which I'm really happy to see, but it doesn't touch on all of the work that staff have been doing in industrial. And I'm thinking like Dot Foods, for example, huge win, but there's no opportunity to capture that as a success in the plan. So just curious if that's...
And I think council will know we've had quite a bit of conversations lately about media strategy, and we've been trying to improve that. I think we need to be out there trumpeting more, because we've had some very significant industrial development in the last little while, and we need to be educating the public both on that and you know, it is sort of obvious in this report that it doesn't really focus that much on industrial. We were already in process on a number of that things and trying to encourage that, and our community improvement plan from the past helped us. So we should capitalize on that. We have really kind of looked at that when it talks about commercial and thought in our own minds as staff that it was commercial / industrial, and we've kind of been going under that premise. And we've frankly had more interest in industrial in the last few years than we have had in commercial. However, I can tell you there's a number of commercial interest. We've had a number of inquiries in the last little while, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a number of planning applications in the next few months for commercial developments. So, and council will recall, of course, we had Victor LaBreche and the Plaza. So we have had some. It's not that it's been without any. But we have sort of taken it that we're doing both industrial and commercial. But that, I think one of the things too, it talks about the newsletter, but what we've been trying to say lately, and I think council has heard me say this, and I think I'm taking under the direction and the input that I've heard from you, the council, is we need a more comprehensive media strategy to get more information like that out there. And we're trying to implement that. We've done a couple little pilot projects, and I think you'll see a more comprehensive. That's yet another policy that'll probably be coming in front of council very shortly, is a media strategy too. So, and again, you know, as you can see, I'm glad a number of these policies are written already, or mostly written, because if not, it would be a lot to do. But just even getting them in front of council, you know, to purposely put them on the agenda, have them considered, you know, re-review them, and get them on the agenda and have council consider them and adjust them. It's going to take time. So there's some timing issues there just from the volume of things that we're trying to accomplish all at once, so.
Thank you. So because of all of what we've talked about, adult foods and the priorities of community, I caution council not to feel like we're moving faster than we should, but I think being able to rejig what we know is a priority now that requires time. For example, if 200 people come, they're going to need a place to live. We don't want people living in Woodstock and London just because there's no accommodation. So I think the fact that it is a priority in the strategic plan, I don't think it's going to hurt us if we consider on a priority basis as of right now what we need to focus on. And I think that's a discussion we should be open to have because of timing and urgency.
Yeah, the only caveat I would say to that is that, we can create policies to somewhat incentivize certain types of development, but aside from actually buying and building housing yourself, that's the only real way you can make housing and that's a very costly venture. So you are still somewhat dependent, just as we are with commercial, just as we are with industrial. You're somewhat dependent on those individual property owners. And a good example is in the past, it's hard to believe that this is the past, but in the past you would buy land and you would actually develop your own industrial park as a method to incentivize that industrial development. And that was the way it's been for my entire career, nearly 30 years. That's how we did it. But just recently, there has been so much demand for industrial property that we're starting to see private developers come along and develop their own industrial parks and their own industrial properties for lease and for sale. So that is an unusual circumstance, but that's how you typically did industrial development. Residential development has always been that way, that it's virtually always done. I've only known of one or two municipalities that develop their own, and it can be very costly, and when it goes wrong, it can go very wrong. But usually it's done by private developers. So then you try to create policies and planning that puts things in place so that you encourage the right type of development and that it occurs. But that is true of the entire province, and what has been identified in the province and as a regional issue is that what we've been doing hasn't been enough. So the province has come up with new laws in order to say we want to incentivize more housing across the board, and here's some of the policies that we're going to implement to do that. Some of which we may agree with, some of which we may not agree with, but that's what has happened because it's not only our problem, it's across the entire board. So there will be some things that council can do to incentivize that, but I would caution that aside from taking the entire project on yourself, which we literally probably couldn't financially do because of our limitations on borrowing and so on. So it's a difficult thing to incentivize to implement completely.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that too is that there's no quick fixes. We need to really think about the long term, about our strategy and the policies we put in place to make sure that we have long-term investment within the community and that we don't create problems for future generations or future councils that they're going to have to solve. We're also going to have to work with our other levels of government. We're under one official plan for the county, so we have to be in line with that. We have to be in line with the legislation from the province, which is changing every 5 minutes. So we need to make sure that we're in line with that. The official plan for the county is due to come up. It hasn't been updated in a long time, so that's a process that needs to happen. And there's lots of talk of more density and stuff like that. So these are all items that can go into that. When we're talking about the housing strategy, we need to think about the long term, what we want to see in Ingersoll over the long term, so that when developers buy land, they know what they can build as we bring that land on and what's there over the long term. If we get too, Michael has a saying, and I'm going to steal it from him. We're not a speedboat. We can't turn very fast. We're like a cruise ship or an oil tanker. So we need to make sure we put those inputs in very carefully and set that direction, because if we just can't turn around in 5 seconds. That's the problem with that one. But lots to think about anyway. That's good stuff. Lots to think about.
And if I could, just some historical perspective. When Cami came, there wasn't enough housing for the individuals, and there wasn't enough housing really across Oxford County. And, but a lot of those people that first came to those jobs drove from further distances. Over time, all of the municipalities in Oxford County grew and eventually accommodated those. When Toyota came, there wasn't enough housing for Toyota either. So then we grew slowly, and a lot of the growth we've seen is, and that's not an unusual way that things go. That's two historical perspectives right from Oxford County that's how it's gone. And the mayor's exactly right. And as I say, you know, when we're a large ship, sometimes moving through the harbor, if we move too fast, we're going to wash a bunch of boats ashore, and they're going to be upset with us. They like us to be predictable and smooth and steady. And so we got to think long-term how we get in this big boat all the way over there and move through that process. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's actually, if you remember Jerry Klingberg, he's a realtor in town, and I remember telling me that he got into real estate right when Cami was coming in. And there was a lot, all of a sudden Cami, the announcement came, and all these speculators came, and they thought, and then nobody bought a house because they drove. So the market had a different reason, a different accommodation method than everybody thought. So, Councillor Hallerud.
So I'm more focused on the affordability of housing and the variety that we, like you said, should consider as a master plan. So not just being able to come in and say because you own the land, you build it, and then it's just new housing for new development. I'm thinking, like we had this discussion, Michael, I was thinking when we think of replacing the Merc, have we thought about, say, the old arena? That's a possibility, and I'm told that it's the conservation authorities that might limit us there. Well, does council have the power to ask for a report to see if it's even feasible? Because when you take a look at the cost to replace the flooring, what if that flooring could just be a base for a quad, you know, a 4-story for downtown affordable housing? Is it something we could consider different levels of government? We've got access to funding, maybe a partnership for low-income housing with the county. There's so many things that we can think of, and I'm just trying to say we need to also consider different types and different strategies, not just the selling of land and buildings of new homes. So that's kind of where we usually get carried away thinking that, but that's a lot of space downtown could build up rather than thinking of building even wider is kind of where I want to, since you wanted us to get the ideas on here, so I'm just hoping.
And I think one of the things that we need to analyze too is, and we've already started to gather some of this data in the housing strategy, is we also have to analyze where we've been and where we're going. There's sort of a conception out there that we have missed out on some more high-density residential, but proportionately, I don't think we have missed out on all that much. If you look at some of the things, and that's what we've got to analyze, a lot of the developments that we've had in the last few years have been much more high density. We've had a lot of more townhouse blocks built. We've had other condo units built. We've had, you know, we had the VMS school. It was formerly a school, completely converted to apartments. So we've had the retirement building built. We've had, you know, it wasn't that many years the Canterbury apartments were built. So some people say we haven't had so many apartments since the 80s or something. That's not true. We have had quite a few, and we need to analyze that, and we need to look at those numbers and show what we've gotten. And I think we can show that we've had a lot more densities in the last few years than we realize. So what has worked and what should we continue to do, and what hasn't worked and what should we incentivize more in another direction?
Seeing no other discussion or questions, I will call on Councillor Use, please.
Thank you. Moved by myself, Councillor Hughes, seconded by Councillor Hallerud, that the Council of the Corporation of the Town of Ingersoll receive the strategic plan orientation presentation as information.
Any discussion on that? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And we will now move on to the next presentation, which is asset management.
Okay, so I'm going to give a big caveat here to say that I am not the asset management expert in this room. That would go to our very good treasurer, who's much more skilled at this. But what I'm trying to do with this particular slide deck, and Irina covers some of this in her own slide deck, and we also have our full-blown asset management plan, which if you read, then you've had a lot more time than I thought you've had. But this is to try to give a bit of a historical perspective of how did we get here and why and what is asset management about. One of the really key things that municipalities do is invest in their infrastructure. In our case, being a two-tier county, our infrastructure is our roads, our sidewalks, our bridges, our culverts, and our storm sewers. In the county's case, it's water and sewer and those kinds of structures, and of course, our facilities and so on. So this is just to give a little bit of background of asset management. So 20 years ago, we got a lot of funding from provincial governments, and that funding ended and when Mike Harris was in government, and he changed everything and said, we're going to create the Ontario Municipal Partnership. So he essentially got rid of all other funding that was there for infrastructure. You used to get what they called conditional grants and unconditional grants, and they got rid of all that, and they created this Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund. It was essentially the same amounts of dollars. Since that time, the OMPF has just slowly reduced to next to nothing, and municipalities were left to create their own pay structure to pay for that infrastructure. And that created a huge deficit. I remember when this first began to happen, there were, the AMO was talking about billions of dollars of deficit across Ontario. The province just sort of slowly ate away at the OMPF, and that created more of a dependence on property tax as a revenue stream. So as you can see, this chart is here to depict the OMPF reduction. It is quite remarkable how much is reduced in just the last 10 years. And we're down to the point where it's down to very minimal. Now, we have had some gas tax and some specific funding like that, but this is just an example of what has happened with our funding. And I should say also, some of the rural municipalities get significantly more OMPF than we do, than the small urbans. So unfortunately, small urbans tend to lose out. So what that did was create more of a pressure on property taxes. And as you can see, property taxes in Canada represent more of a total tax revenue than in a lot of other jurisdictions. And that chart is rather a busy chart now that I look at it here. But as you can see, you know, we're similar to UK and US, but a lot of other jurisdictions don't have that much property tax. So what that created was the province realized that some municipalities just weren't doing any infrastructure investment. So they decided we should develop asset management. This was also an accounting principle as a good way of handling infrastructure and how to replace it and ensure that you're planning properly for it. So what is asset management? It's essentially a system to predict and plan for the replacement of equipment, facilities, and infrastructure before it fails. So the first thing you need to do is determine how many assets you have. In our case, the roads, sidewalks, storm sewers, street lights, but also our facilities, parks, equipment, and even vehicles. In the county's case, of course, it's sewer and water. Then we determine the condition of those assets, what condition they're in currently. Then you determine when you believe it will need to be replaced based on that condition. Then you estimate what you believe the cost will be, which has gotten much more difficult in high inflation times, but that's what you do. And then you must determine what you must put away for money in order to prepare for the replacement of that asset. So if you're doing it properly, you determine an average of what you need every year, and you budget for that amount, and you build up your budget in order to handle that amount. Some years will be more, and other years will be less. That's why the best practice is to average those expenditures over a number of years and try to build up reserves in order to accommodate those years where it's going to cost more or less. So those years where it's less, you put money into reserves. Those years where it's more, you spend out of reserves. So having a good reserve is beneficial to doing your asset management plan properly. And that means you're spending money on current dollars rather than debt dollars, because if you're spending it totally on debt, you're not getting as much bang for your public dollar. So, because the province decided to have, originally they sort of encouraged the asset management plans, and this started 10, 12 years ago. But eventually they said some municipalities still weren't doing very much, so they said you have to have an asset management plan, and you have to have your hard assets analyzed. They had to be done by July of this year, and you have to do your softer assets, like some of your facilities and your equipment, in 2025, in the summer 25. We're actually at the point where we've done both, and we're ahead of the game on that. And but what we're going to talk about in the next few slides is really just our core assets, because not everybody else has done both. So we wanted to compare sort of apples to apples, and we tried to look at some other municipalities that were somewhat similar in size and scope. So our assets are broken down here, our core assets. The total value of our core assets, that question of what number of assets do we have, this is what we've analyzed. We have 160 million, and of course roads makes up the bulk of that, but as you can see, storm and bridges is a pretty high number as well.
Well, that's today's dollar figure, correct?
That's right.
And then you guys update that yearly to
That's right.
account for changes in inflation?
Yes, that's the replacement value of the assets, not historical cost.
No, but that would be in
But in
today's
today's
dollars.
yes,
okay.
our best estimate, yeah.
And I'm delighted to have Irina here to answer technical questions for me. So we decided to compare ourselves to Tillsonburg and Central Elgin, and as you can see, they have more core assets than we do. They both do. When you look at their total asset value is quite a bit higher. More roads. We are comparable with bridges, and storm sewers are pretty similar. So, but that's a comparator. So then from that, as we showed through how you calculate this, you come up with what your assets are, what you think they will cost, and you come up with what your funding targets are per year. So this is the funding targets for every one of our municipalities, the total target, the roads target, the bridge target, and the storm target. One thing I'd like to point out here is Central Elgin, if you go back one slide, had quite a bit more total assets, and so did Tillsonburg. But if you go forward one slide, Central Elgin has quite a bit more higher of a funding target, and but Tillsonburg does not. So if you look at that, funding target is based on the calculated replacement cost, and then you put that over the number of years that you expect it to be the asset life, and that's how you come up with the funding target.
Just to clarify there, Mr. CEO, so that basically what you're saying is that people are taking different strategies to asset management here from these slides.
And we'll get a little deeper into that. Yeah.
Okay, okay, perfect.
So if you look at the total money spent per year on core assets, this is how much we're spending per year. As you can see, you would expect that Central Elgin would be significantly higher, and where we are at is lower, but Tillsonburg is lower still. So that creates a deficit. So each of us have a deficit, and we're fairly comparable to Central Elgin. They spend more, but they have a higher funding target, so their deficit is still slightly higher than us, but as a percentage, they're actually doing more of their percentage. We have a funding target deficit of 1.5 million. But if you look at Tillsonburg, they have a funding deficit of 3 million. But I point out that they also have more assets, and their funding targets are lower. So it took us a while to analyze that, and we looked at it, and as one comparator, some of it depends on what you establish as your service level. So in our service level, on average, we're averaging that we expect our roads to last about 25 years. Tillsonburg is expecting their roads would last on average about 45 years. So they've established a different funding level. So even though that is the case, they still have, because they're not investing as much as we are per year, they have a deficit that's higher than ours. If they were funding at our service levels, they would have an even higher deficit than that. It would be close to double that. Whereas Central Elgin's target is a lot more like ours, which their service level, as is the county's, is quite similar.
So there's no specific, what's the word I'm looking for? There's no specific target or parameters that are set out by the province to say roads are going to last 30 years.
That's right. And there may be some cases where, depending on where you are, if you're in northern Ontario with more frost, maybe your roads last not as long. But no, there isn't a set, when they come up with asset management plans, they let every municipality establish their own service levels. But there is some industry norms. We think our criteria that we're using is sort of a best practices and sort of an industry norm. So if I were in front of you, if I were in front of Tillsonburg Council, I would be concerned that we would need to bring that number down. But when you're looking at a $3 million deficit, you'd probably want to work on that first. So I feel comfortable with our service level that we're recommending to you now. So this shows, as I talked about, the percentage of the core assets funded. In Central Elgin's case, they're funding more of a percentage of it because they have more. That still puts them in a higher deficit than us. We're funding to the tune of about 66,000, but again, Tillsonburg's funding even less. One of the ways you handle infrastructure, of course, is through debt and reserves. So as you can see, Tillsonburg's carrying a lot more debt than we are, and in Central Elgin to handle that. So they don't have a lot of wiggle room with that to fund their infrastructure. And as well, reserves. We carry more reserves so that we can balance out those years. So when you look at our reserves and Central Elgin's and Tillsonburg's, we're significantly higher to balance out those years.
With our plan, is our deficit in our funding, that's incorporating the items, the facilities and the parks?
This is only, these numbers are just on core assets.
So you're just,
We
okay, just
still-
core, okay.
Yeah, we still need to spend more on those core assets as we move forward.
No, I just wanted to know the comparators there.
And part of it is with the plan, because this asset management plans are relatively new, we're trying to analyze them every year and update the numbers so that we ensure that we're, first of all, assessing, we think we got a pretty good handle on the number of assets that we have, but are we assessing their current condition properly? Are we assessing their lifespan properly? So we'll know more as time goes on, and that may assist in diminishing the deficit. Yeah, so that's really the core of the asset management presentation. It's really there to talk about what the core assets are and compare them. We also have done an taken a look at our facilities, and you will see that in some of Irina's report. We'll talk about where we're at with some of the facilities and some of the other where we're at with that deficit. One of the biggest issues in the facilities, of course, is the MRC. And the MRC is something that, because our arena is deteriorating, as its lifespan is coming to an end, we know it is one of the key assets that needs to be upgraded. So our facilities looks worse than our core assets, but one of the key ones in that is the MRC. I know that's a lot to take in, but if there's any questions.
Questions from council?
Not so much a question, but something I suppose we'll have to think about at some point, is the asset management plan, to my knowledge, doesn't consider climate adaptation or mitigation. So I don't know if anybody saw this week, there was a report from the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario projecting something like a 27% increase in cost to stormwater if we don't do anything, that just goes up the less you do. So I'm just curious how we even begin to think about not just, the today's dollars, but also imagining climate adaptation on all of that infrastructure.
We don't currently have an engineer, but we had a couple years ago started to look at our stormwater management system being a system that, instead of just the 100-year flood, would be a 250-year flood. So we've already begun to start to think about those longer-term expenses, but it will continue to increase our costs. There's some discussion around stormwater management ponds. Are they the best system of handling, that kind of runoff? There may be better ways of handling that with more naturalized wetlands and so on. So what best practices are in that is probably going to change over the next few years, but yeah, it's going to be an impact. And we think we've done a good job in our asset management plan so far, but it's one of those items, and because it's such a big ticket item in your budget, it's one that you just can't sort of take the foot off the pedal. You've got to continue to kind of work on and to think about. If you fall behind, it can go really badly really quickly, and so it can get tricky. So, it's one of those you can't rest on your laurels, say, oh, we've done that now. It's just one of those ongoing things. And that's why we wanted to present it to council, to kind of give you that broad perspective of this is one of the key things you'll see in the budgets, and this is why it's important.
So I'll give the example of the rec facility. You talked earlier about how things were funded before, through the province was giving a lot of money before. Rec facilities were traditionally funded by grants from the upper tier. We're seeing less and less of that. Obviously, when we applied before, there was $5.4 billion asked for, because municipalities that's the way they're funded. And so what we're seeing all the time is services are downloaded, the costs are downloaded, and we haven't, unfortunately, the municipalities were not really told that message. So the odds of getting funding are different. Now they're saying, okay, we want to fund these things differently. If we known that 20, 30 years ago, we could have planned for that through asset management, and if that was a thing then, and then we could have had the funds ready. John received a nice shiny new fire truck this year. They were early adopters of asset management. That fire truck was paid for and ready to go. We weren't going out for, oh my God, we got to get a fire truck and we got to find a way to fund it. So these are things to think about. That'll come into play with our asset management plan with the new MERC coming online, because it won't last forever either, but we'll have this information. The great thing about asset management is we're making evidence-based decisions when we're going to use our infrastructure dollars. Our roads are rated, so when a road needs to come up for work, it's not, oh, it's in front of this person's house. I hate to say the Roads Commission might have done that back in the day, but it's evidence-based. It's because it has a low score. It's because it's deteriorating and it needs to be done. So these are all positive things that I think makes me such a fan of asset management, and previous councils have really adopted and gone ahead and beat the clock on what's required, because once you get invested in it, it truly saves you money over time. We fund all our infrastructure, mostly, I don't know if we all do a MERC, but when we do our roads, they're paid for that year. And so it's a little bit higher on taxes, but we're not going into debt and paying it for 20 years. We're not buying pickup trucks on debt. We know when stuff's going to wear out. We know when stuff's going to be replaced. And again, the fire truck's our biggest, most expensive vehicle asset, but the money was sitting in the bank waiting for it. So it's not a hit on the taxpayers, and it helps level out that. And of course, there's going to be there's climate change, there's different government policies, there's inflation, and that's why it's reviewed yearly to try to mitigate those changes as much as possible. But if we didn't have it, wow, we could we'd be in trouble real fast for sure.
And that's exactly right, Mayor. And by having a good asset management plan and implementing it properly, you're really again trying to create that predictability that you can expect year to year. This is what we're going to be spending. This is where we're going, and that we're investing, and the predictability that the community's roads are not going to suddenly fall apart and have some, London saw it a number of years ago with the sinkhole in their downtown. It was sort of common knowledge for a long time that London wasn't investing in their infrastructure, and it came back to bite them in a really horrible way. And if you look at them now, they're actually got a quite robust asset management system, because they had a serious failure that caused a lot of issues. So, yeah. That's why that predictability, to be able to say, we can predict that we've got this under control.
And just to add to, I think why previous councils have jumped on asset management, we were in that situation as well, where previous councils used the reserves to mitigate tax increases. And those reserves are there for a specific reason. And all of a sudden there was no reserves. And so it becomes very important. The message became very hard learned here, was that we need to put that money away for a specific purpose, so it's there when we need it, and it not maybe for other purposes such as tax mitigation. But there's always that option, of course, to council as always. But yeah, it's a hard fought lesson to not have the resources available when you need them, and then you have debt. That's the only other option, is when you need to fix something, is debt. So. Any other further questions, comments? Seeing none, then I will call
Mike, please.
Sorry, I'll call on Councillor Hallerue for a resolution if there's no more questions or comments.
Moved by myself, Councilor Hallerue, that seconded by Councilor Hudson, that the Council of the Corporation of the Town of Ingersoll receive the asset management orientation presentation as information.
Discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor? That's carried. We will now move on to the MERC presentation.
So one of the biggest things I've heard in the community is that, we'd like to get moving on the multi-use recreation facility. We've known our arena is starting to deteriorate, and that's some of the things we talk about in this. This is not intended today to make any major decisions for council. I'm not trying to force you to make a big decision tonight, but I just wanted to kind of give some of the background on it. And, we came through, for a number of years, this community was fighting really kind of for its life when we were fighting the landfill. What our community would look like and what it would, maybe some would say what it would smell like, but it was truly a struggle for what this community would be. We came immediately out of the landfill fight after winning that, and something that the whole community worked on. And after winning that, and then immediately went into COVID. Now, coming out of COVID, it's time for us to start to look at what are we need to get working on the multi-use recreation facility. So I'm just trying to give some background here on some of the issues that we're facing and have council think about the concepts so they can start to think about, there will likely be a report coming forward in the new year to start to say, okay, it could be a discussion item for budget. Is there a direction that council would like to start going in, and what would they like to start thinking about? So, as we know, the new arena, or the current arena, is nearing the end of its lifespan and will require significant repairs. A new MERC has been designed and 12 acres has been set aside in our current industrial park. The original design was estimated to cost about $25 million. The town has applied for funding previously but was not successful. There was a lot of competition in that funding, and you had hundreds of municipalities competing for, very few dollars, and only a few municipalities across Ontario got any funding. So this slide is to look at some of the current costs to remain in the current facility, and just one of the biggest items we've kind of circled there is that in the very near future, we're looking at the concrete floor. Kyle can get into some specific details, but we know that floor is starting to fail in certain ways. But those costs are not the only ones. We've got a number of upgrades that have been sort of postponed in the last few years, anticipating that we might be moving to a new facility. We can extend some of the life of the facility, but every time we're extending, we're at this point, without doing a major overhaul, we're really kind of putting Band-Aids on problems and not really curing the issue. And further, if we ended up, doing some major infrastructure, we're only left with a small facility that isn't really, I think, what the community wants. And certainly is only an ice pad and doesn't involve any other additional uses, which I think the community would like to have added into that. And you're looking at some significant dollars, just $1.75 million for the concrete floor, not to mention all the other works. So in summary, if we're looking at the current facility, you're talking at least a couple $1 million and other works that have not been set aside. Some of our analysis we've done for asset management, we've done building assessments on most of our facilities. I think we're pretty well done all of them now. And that helps us with our asset management. But we know there's another estimated $1 million just in the facility itself and upgrades that need to occur. So we did have Nicholson Sheffield completed schematic drawings and costing. We have asked them to do the update, as we talked about recently, to see what it would look like if we broke down individual items and what additional costs would be based on new numbers. Once we have those costings, we can talk about next steps. And that's why here today we're not making any decisions, because we don't have a fulsome report for you. This is just the concepts. Just so you know, this is the timeline that if we were to get going immediately, we would have to do the design, which would take 3 months, and we'd of course involve the community in some of that. Construction documents would take about 5 months to do. We'd have to put it out to tender, which would take a couple months, and then the construction. So you're looking at anywhere from 2 to 3 years from design to construction completion if you fired the gun and said, Michael, go tomorrow. We did look at campaign coaches previously, and they thought there was a potential to raise some dollars in the community of a couple $1 million. But they recommended not proceeding with the capital campaign until we've identified the project and we know where it's going to go, so that we can communicate to the public, this is what you're actually buying into. And I think that the community would want that. So that's sort of obvious. Right now, we know we have Clark Road as the only site that's shovel-ready. There was discussion at one point about the North Town line. There would need to be a number of studies done for that and various reports that could take a couple of years. And that would also, or potentially a boundary adjustment, which could also take some time. So it really sort of depends on what timing we go, where we might have options. It wouldn't necessarily be our first choice to go to Clark Road because it's an industrial subdivision, but it is shovel-ready. So when we're applying for grants, we use it as our application right now, because if they gave us, you know, sort of 2/3 or 3/4 dollars, we would gladly take that, and we would build a facility rather quickly in that site. So there may be some other options as well. So again, estimated cost of the design was 25 million. We don't know, you know, we've seen inflation gone up on a number of these things, so we've seen a number of capital projects where it could have ballooned as high as 40 million. I'm starting to see that come back down a bit more, so I'm a little more optimistic we may not be as high as 40 million. So, but, you know, in our facilities, this is the single biggest issue, as I talked about. So you can see this is a slide from our asset management plan for facilities, and the red is, of course, the very poor condition, and that's really reflective. One of the biggest items in that red is the arena facility. So one good thing is, once you solve that problem, again, your facilities will be in a very good asset management place too. But as the mayor aptly pointed out, we'll have to plan for replacement of it in the future years as well. So just to give you a ballpark idea, if the municipality decided to go it alone, and if we had, some of those slides I can read from here, but this one I can't, I gotta look at the screen. So that one's a little harder to read the print. But if we were to go it alone, if it was $20 million and an interest rate of 4 years, we put it over 25 years, we'd have to debt finance that. It would cause a tax increase of 7%. So this is a large project. If it was 25 million, again, 4%, and would put it over a 20-year term, then of course a 10% tax increase. If it's 40 million, and if interest rates stay high, we're at 6%, you're talking a 17% tax increase. So it's a nasty hit if we were to go it completely alone.
And that's nothing to do with operational increases at all either.
That's just capital.
That's just
Totally
capital.
Good point. That is just capital on that.
Yeah, it's got nothing to do with operationals. It also doesn't have anything to do with the increases we've got to have to keep up with inflation and asset management and other areas.
Yeah,
This
this
is just
solely
this is just to
MERC.
build the building.
Solely to build a building, yeah, and then you'd have to fill it, right, so.
So now having said that, that would just be arguably for that 25 or 20-year term, correct?
That's right.
Then-
Yeah, it could conceivably end. Some of you may be aware of the municipality of Bayham that bought a submarine. It cost them, was it 12% or 20%? Now I forget which one it was, 12, wasn't it? So they upped their taxes 12% for 20 years until they pay it off, with the intention that they would actually go back down after that point.
Mr. Mayor, through you, I just want to say, I think this is one of the areas in which we really need to think deep and broad. If I were looking at this just as a blind person, just expecting some validation for these numbers, I'd also expect to see some revenue generation from these facilities. Isn't there any revenue that can be used to show, even if it was just 0.5% or 10%, that something would cost? When you project revenue as well as cost, it does bring the cost down, because I think this tends to scare people from making any decision at all. And then I feel like if we looked at investments as more revenue generators than actual tax increases, we could find a way to balance where we end up, whether we're going to increase taxes. I don't want to see this as something that is just, if we did this and this is going to be the tax rate. Because when you take a look at building a MERC and you consider the growth the population is going to bring, you consider taxes from other sources, like you said, extra homes and industrials, to kind of help populate the use of these MRFs, creating a future where there is rooms to be rented, there's sports facilities to be rented, there's games to be hosted. I think we need to also see a little bit of data that kind of balances this out, so that when we're looking at a cost, we're not just seeing just the cost, we're seeing potential revenue that might help us kind of eliminate some of that high cost.
Oh, I'm sure we will see that data. The problem is that no facility is revenue generating. We actually subsidize, they're all subsidized. There's not, except maybe Rogers Center and Labatt Center, but they're heavily subsidized as well through different ways because you get those. But there will be some revenue generated from user groups, but unfortunately, when we were in the facility, the feasibility study, none of those groups wanted to see their fees increase. So it's a tricky one. This is a service that the community needs, but it is going to cost the community. I don't think there'd be any way to generate $25 million and to operation costs. It's going to be higher than the one it is now to operate, especially with the added services. It's a tricky one, and that's why it hasn't happened as of yet. Obviously, historically, like I said, it was an issue of they were dealing with trying to keep taxes low within the community. There was a lot of other buildings built. I don't know why that wasn't one of them. That's a question I haven't been able to answer. I haven't been able to uncover. But then all of a sudden the party was over, and of course when you're getting 17% and 14% tax increases, that's not an arena. And then it was the landfill. So hopefully we can overcome the hurdles and be the council that provides this. And I think we can. But Kyle, I'll pass it over to you.
So yeah, as Mayor Petrie alludes to, if we actually charged what recreation costs to the end user, no one would be able to afford to participate. So if the users actually paid what an hour of ice time is actually worth, and that's just to break even, no one would ever participate. So every rec facility is highly subsidized to begin with. These numbers that Michael are giving in here also, this is likely, as I know Michael gets to later in this presentation, is we will be using multiple different tools to be able to reach the end goal. This is using absolutely no tool. This is just using
Totally going it alone.
totally going it alone. As Michael will get to later in the presentation, we likely aren't going to go at it totally alone. We will take multiple tools to our advantage to try and bring this number down. This is just a high level. If we were to totally go at it alone, if we had no reserves, if we had this would be the hit.
That's right. And yeah, we do talk about some options here in a couple slides, but I do also want to point out this is just the capital. So even though you may generate more revenue, your operating costs are also likely to go up. And I'm not talking about, because we might be able to green the facility, I'm not talking about utility costs, but it's just, it can cost a fair bit to actually run a facility. And the larger the facility, some of it would be things that we don't currently have that you're not paying for if you've got, gyms and, well, we do have a gym, but I mean, walking track and, those kinds of things, we wouldn't have all that. So there may be additional costs there. So you may generate more revenue, but I don't think you're really going to generate much revenue that's going to offset your capital. So that's why we need to look at other options. So
these options, are the options for funding or options for the facility to offer, so that we could actually generate more than just recreational, I'm thinking if this is the forum for us to be able to inject ideas, we have a lot of industrial spaces, we have a lot of commercial coming to town. We don't have any 5-star rated place that anyone could use for a conference or convention. I'm thinking bigger, ideas to kind of merge with a recreational facility where you are actually constantly housing, corporate and other big businesses coming to town. I think since this has been an idea that has been on for almost 20 years or more, I think this council, I think we should really caution ourselves on how we should focus on just what the original plan was. Maybe this is the time that you expand your horizon and really think about how it is going to cost money, but how can we also mitigate that by providing something that we currently don't have that helps us to kind of, that's all. I just wanted to inject that. And if it's a report that we need to kind of see it that way, just looking at something different from what it has always been, just to focus on creation, it could be more than
My only
that.
caution from a staff perspective is we do have a facility in town, the Elmhurst, that is providing fairly big sort of conference facilities, and we know they are talking about potential expansion. I don't like, if I can avoid it, competing with private business, so I like to
Okay.
try to stay out of it if I can. If they're gonna supply that, then I'd rather stay out of that, because what ends up happening is nobody wins and we end up killing a business. And so my first thought is that would be something, I'd have to really see numbers to say that it would be successful. But, yeah, but it's not to say there aren't other ideas to generate revenues, but.
Okay.
Yeah, and what we can do is also provide some of the background information, the studies we did to the new council members as well, to be able to provide that background and the thought process of where we've gotten to so far. And the minutes probably from the working group of all the stakeholders and the feasibility study that was done. A lot of options were explored, and yeah, a lot of concepts were explored. I'm not saying they can't be explored again, it's just there's that knowledge out there already for a lot of it, and I'm happy to share all that with everyone to make sure everybody's on the same page.
And to be clear, the point you're making is valid in that this number is a big number, but it's not intended to scare, it's to say, like, this is the absolute worst case scenario if you went all on your own, and that's not something we'd suggest either. That doesn't make any sense. That's not, so we do have some options, and we'll get to that. Before we get to that, I do want to point out that Irina talks here on this slide about the debt limit. We only can take on debt of up to $43 million, so of course we wouldn't want to go that high, but it's important to note that we can't just sort of we don't have an unlimited amount that we can spend. There are limitations, and that's required by the Municipal Act, so. But that brings us to options. So of course, some of the options are to repair the existing building, but we know those costs that are above and sort of what that leaves us with. We could pay for the full cost of the new facility ourselves, and that's that slide above. One of the options is you could pare the new building down, new facility, and build it in stages. So then you would deal with each stage as you proceed, one by one. So you build the arena pad first and then add to it each thing. We could run a fundraising campaign in the community. We already know that would be a couple $1 million, so that would come, if we could generate that kind of money, that would come off the top of that figure. We could also apply for more funding, and one of the ways we could do that is we could lobby the federal and provincial governments for funding. We know some of the municipalities have been successful, have done that. If we got funding, if we're talking about $25 million and some communities are getting, 2/3 or 3/4 funding, if you're getting something like $15 to $20 million, that scenario changes drastically. And, then when you're adding new things to it that are going to generate revenue, you're bringing your operating costs down significantly. It's a lot more viable to think big picture if you're getting those kinds of funds. One of the other things too, though, we should point out is we also have been building up our reserves for this for the last few years on purpose because we knew this was coming. So you wouldn't ever really end up in that, to your point, that worst case scenario, because we already have a significant amount of money set aside that would be put into it. And and realistically, how do you take on a very big project? You do it a number of ways. You don't do it just one of these ways. Staff would never advise you, let's just build it and spend the money and, rack up the taxes and let's go. That's not our advice to you, because that's not very practical. So it's really a whole number of these solutions. And, it's likely to be fundraising in the community, try for provincial and federal funding, use our reserves, utilize debt, potentially stage the facility. All those things could be possibilities to make it a viable facility and to get going on it. And as I say, I haven't put this here for council to make any big decisions today. I just want you to start to think about the things that are associated with it, the costs and some of the difficulties surrounding this, so that council's aware and start to think about what some of these things. And there probably are other solutions out there as well that, could assist in whittling that number down.
I just want to echo what Mayor Petrie talks about, that at this stage of the game anyways with the MERC, there was a subcommittee of council that went through various phases. to come up with the designs of what is currently included in that $25 million price tag. So that was done over a series of studies. So I'm going to support his statement in which those items came out of what the community was looking for. And then Michael touched on that we've built up the reserves knowing that this was going to happen, and it will take multiple tools to be able to make it happen. Coming from a municipality in Saskatchewan where we built a new facility similar to this, it takes multiple tools to be able to accomplish a project of this scale. So it's not, we won't be able to do it with just one thing. It will take multiple tools to get there. But that time, it's the premise of doing this report, that time is coming sooner rather than later.
And that's exactly right, and that's what we're trying to get council to think about is, remember those timelines, remember some of those things, all cognizant of cost too, because if you want this accomplished within a certain time frame, you need to direct us to when and you want us to sort of get going on those and what steps you might want to take.
Realistically, Kyle, how long do we have before the floor has to be ripped up? And then can you explain a little bit of the Fernie BC situation, how brought all that on?
Yeah, so I will try my best here because it's a convoluted answer. So Fernie BC had an incident and it dovetails into asset management and having a good asset management plan and not running your refrigeration plant beyond its life cycle, that you're doing the necessary repairs every year to ensure that you don't end up in a situation like Fernie BC. One of the good things that came out of the Fernie BC incident is that Simcoe Refrigeration and pretty much any refrigeration company that works on arena ice plants now does life cycle assessments of all arena ice plants. And you're supposed to do them every 5 years. You're not legislated to. It will probably be directly dovetailed in with 2025 when we have to do that. That clearly outlines every one of specifically only your refrigeration plant, and they've taken data from ice plants in ice plant settings, because a lot of, as Michael alluded to and Irina alluded to, when you're doing asset management, you're doing it on your service level, but how long does a pump last? What's its expected lifespan from the manufacturer? The problem from a recreational standpoint is there isn't that data on how long does that pump last in a recreation environment? How long does that compressor last in a recreation environment? So they've been gathering information over the last couple of years now to get an idea of how long do these assets typically last in a recreation setting. So that's how we're able to come up with the chart that Michael showed earlier in the slide deck of this stuff is coming up in these years, because that's how long they've seen typically floors last or typically condensers last. So when it comes to the floor, the basics of how the floor works, I've gone over this with council during the COVID shutdowns, is that most people think of refrigeration as we're adding cooling to an environment to cool it down. Refrigeration is actually the process of removing heat. So you aren't adding cold, you are removing heat. So the process in which you remove heat to be able to create ice is you have a series of brine lines that are looped throughout the concrete floor. They have a solution that runs through them. We use glycol, there's brine, there's various options you run through these various pipes that run in the concrete. Some places have sand floors, so you can see the brine lines, and you can also fix them if there becomes a leak, you can see them. When you have concrete floors, which are easier to build ice on, if you have a problem with one of those lines, it's not as obvious as where that leak may be. I can tell you that we have had leaks in our floor. It's a 40-year-old floor. We have had leaks. Luckily, those leaks are at places we can access. So they are at where connections are, or they are at somewhere that we can reach. The absolute worst case scenario, which is highly unlikely, so I'll preface that. The absolute worst case scenario is we end up with a brine line leak in the middle of the floor. We can't find it, we can't isolate it. There are various tools you have available to you when a leak starts to happen. There's stop leak solutions. You can reline lines, you can isolate lines. You have options. Worst case scenario would be it's in the middle of the floor, none of the stop leak works, we can't find it to isolate it, and we continue to add glycol to the system to get us through. That leak's never going to get better, so that will just get worse and worse and worse over time. So it can happen, and it can happen at a moment's notice, but there are steps in place to mitigate. It's not as if tomorrow I come in and all of a sudden we have a leak and we're closed down. You would have a series of events that lead up to a total floor replacement. The tricky part when it comes to doing a floor is that because it is concrete, once you start to rip it up, you destroy the current brine lines that are there, and all of them. And it also requires removing the boards, removing the glass, and all that work. And what also becomes then a problem is that you lose probably a full ice season to rip the entire floor up and then lay another floor. So then that's all of your current user groups finding somewhere else to go and losing out on that revenue that you would typically have while you do the work, because it will not be something that could be accomplished in an off season. And the tricky part, going back to where I started with Fernie BC, is Fernie BC pushed some of their refrigeration life plant items beyond its life cycle, and unfortunately 2 people died as a result. There's a lot of other factors that go into not them just being older assets, but had those assets been replaced or properly maintained over their lifespan, those 2 people would still be alive today. So although we can extend periods, we risk potential breakdown, and in some respects, not with a floor would we be risking life and limb. But there are aspects of the refrigeration plant that would be risking life and limb by pushing them beyond their life cycle.
Not to sound silly, but is it one of those things where it's possible to drain, to stop using and then consider it obsolete and maybe build something on top of it? Has that been considered as an option?
You can. There's a lot of studies out there that have come out recently when you consider that an ice plant is sat in the same place for long periods of time, how far the frost line ends up going down in that ground to then be usable land after. If I am understanding your question, that frost can be on our current facility, because we've been using it for almost 50 years now, that frost could be 40, 50, 60 feet under the ground. So over time, that will eventually come up if you are no longer using it. So all of that moisture will eventually come out.
So you can't build something on top of it and take advantage of that?
You can, but you have to realize that that frost is eventually going to be coming out of the ground. Because you have froze it for 8 months a year, thawed it for 6, froze it for 8, year after year after year, that frost line just gets further and further down. So the ground, not just beneath the ice plant, as you go down, is still frozen.
So there's challenges is what you're saying.
It's not as if it can't be done, but there are challenges associated with building on where an ice pad is because of the frost.
I did not know that.
Hence the reason, I think, why when we used to have events down there in August, the floor was still cold. We were still cold in that building, even though it was like 30 degrees outside, you were still cold.
Because you are removing heat. You're not adding cold. Even your fridge works the same way. Your fridge doesn't add cold, it removes heat.
I think I was misunderstood. I'm not talking about building. I'm talking about building another ice rink on top of that. Like you said, some of them are transparent, right? And we can see the pipes.
Sand-based?
Yeah, some of them
So
are
you're saying
sand.
instead of just leaving that pad and then building on top
Yeah,
of that
instead
pad
of
to
just
make a new
draining
pad?
whatever you use underneath it, considering it obsolete, it may be cheaper to just place a whole new sheet over it because of that advantage, is what I'm saying. If we've actually looked at that, and maybe if not, take a look at that.
To my knowledge, never been done in a recreation setting to put like a, if we kept our current concrete pad and then adding another layer of brine lines over top that concrete pad. To my knowledge, has never been done in a recreation environment because of the work required to plumb that all back into the ice plant. And what that would then mean for your boards, the common process that I've seen everywhere is you rip out the floor and you start again, not to build on top.
Anyway, we'd be looking at a significant cost either way to a 50-year-old facility. But, so it's just something to give council, I just wanted the Fernie BC reference there, as well as how this came about and why these numbers were here, and actual timelines. So, yeah, is it life and limb? No, but is it a facility that may not work one day? Absolutely. And it's a lot of money to be put into something else that a better facility that would meet all the needs instead of just that single one. So, all right. Do you want to continue?
Okay, yeah. One of the goals we have for council, of course, in the new year too, is to do a facilities tour. So it'd be great to have Kyle show us that facility. Maybe some other ideas like that will come out of that, because that's something I hadn't thought of. So that would be good, and we can see how that integrates into the entire facility and stuff too. So that would be a great facility for us to tour, so that we would have a good understanding of where we're at and what we can do for the short term.
Well, I just got one question, and it sort of piggybacks on Khadidra's question is, you said lining the lines. Is that very similar to what we're doing to our water lines now at county level, right? Where they would go in and put the liner inside? How does that work, and is that a feasible option as well? And if so, does it buy any time?
So to answer your question, it's a tool. The problem when you're using glycol or brine is you're a salt-based solution, which is eating away at any potential lining. So same when it comes to, Michael talks about, and we are looking at options as we're getting updated costing from the engineer on the new MERC on green technology. The problem with green technology and some of this relining of pipes, it's not fully tested in a recreation environment to know how long it could last or how useful the fix could be. So when it comes to green, for example, there are things you can do like heat recapture and geothermal, but there isn't, a lot of that is tested in an environment that isn't our environment. So it could work in Seattle, for example. Their new NHL arena is a carbon neutral facility. Their climate's very different than our climate, so what works there won't necessarily work here. So with some of the tools, they come with caveats of they're not fully tested in this specific environment. So it's a tool that's an option to us, but it's not a proven, tested tool as of yet. That it's not something that's commonly done to be tested to an extent to know how long it would last or if it would be effective. It has been done, just not on a scale to be able to study at this point. So we can do it, it's just not a proven technology, if that's the best way to put it.
More risk.
So is it possible to get reports on the different options to actually fix it then, instead of just a one cost, this is what it's going to cost to fix it? Is it possible to look at different ways, like Lindsay was saying, even a green option, and just really get the facts, whether it backs it up to even try? I'll
try my best here, because there's lots of different tools, so I don't want to be coming to council with like, here's 50 tools we could use, but we only use one. And it might not even be because it will be dependent on the situation. So say we come into a brine line leak situation, we have a refrigeration contractor that we work with that would say, here is your issue, here is your options to fix that issue. And then I would be coming with a report to council if it doesn't fit within the operation budget, which some of it may, putting stop leak in, relining a line, those may all be things I can include in an operating budget and would never come as a council report. If it came as a council report, then I would have the options from the contractor on options we could do to fix it and how long those fixes could last. And I would be making a recommendation based off their knowledge and my knowledge to give to council, here's the situation, here's our options. But to throw out a bunch of options now, I don't know what would happen.
But potentially, we could look at, and the intention with this is to kind of give you a high level, but we should be bringing forward a fulsome report. And even some of these options that I presented here, they're really plain. You know, I don't even list the option of pulling out of reserves, but some of them would be, you know, when we say pay for the full cost of new facilities, we'd say, well, here, we're going to do part of it with reserves, we're going to do part of it with debt, we're going to do part of it, you know, is there an option to sell that site and get some money back? And, you know, there's different things. So expect that you will see a fulsome report of, you know, what are the options, and then council can start to look at that. And in that we could look at, here's some costs and some things that we could do. We could sort of look at a couple of options of I'm talking with my hands, I hit the microphone, but we could look at, you know, if we were gonna just keep the facility going for a couple of years, planning to build a new facility, what would that look like? Or if we wanted to do it for a longer term, what would that look like? And some options that way. We could work on that as a part of that report.
I think you kind of touched on what I was going to say, which is I read this as the ideal scenario is we do not get to the point where we even need to discuss how we replace that floor. So if I'm misunderstanding that, I'll read it differently, but I would hope that we don't need to go down that road.
Yeah, and, you know, I heard, and I think you did as well in the election, that people would like to see a new facility, and it will be our goal too. And it's not, you know, I'm not trying to say it's insurmountable, because it's not. There were a lot of people that told us we couldn't beat a landfill, and we said that's not true, and we proved that we were right. It's the same with this. This is not insurmountable. It's just how do we do it and what are the methods? My recommendation as staff would be we break it into chunks and we deal with it using several tools as opposed to just one plain old tool. You know, if you said to me as a council, Michael, we don't care, spend the money, do it tomorrow, I would strongly say, let's try to do a couple more things. Give me some time to come up with some better options for you. And that's really why this is here. It's just to be high level to get you thinking about that as we move forward with the budget and the future reports. You can start to wrap your head around them a little more.
So that is something too that I want to get council to start thinking about is when we did the strategic plan, the word green and sustainable is in there. And so I think staff is really going to need direction on what that means, because that is a very open-ended statement about what that means. And so we have it in there. People are going to expect us to act on it, which is fine. That's why it's in there. But again, are we asking for a carbon neutral facility? Are we trying to limit usage as much as possible? Do we want solar panels? What does that mean on green facility? Because obviously the cost and the time to be able to plan something like this is humongous. So we really need to have clear direction to staff on what we want to see from the community's point of view of a facility going forward. And we have, and that can give them, make sure that we have a better option coming back to us in a report to say, okay, if you want it to be carbon neutral, it's double, or what, you know what I mean? Like, but there's lower operating costs. So again, it's something to think about, what that means from a strategic plan point of view and buildings going forward as well throughout the community, everything we do. What does that sustainability thing look like? Do we want to match the county in their programs? Do we want to have our own sort of way? Do we want to, there's so many questions there that staff definitely need input from that to be able to make the best decision that we want back from them. Because again, that's gonna really factor into how we do this. Again, Kyle touched on it. If we want the new greenest technology to run the facility, that's probably possible. It's certainly possible, but it may not be the most proven technology. It may end up costing us more in the end. Or we could be leaders. The county example is running hybrid ambulances. They're the first ones in Canada to do it. It's an aftermarket product they put on, and now Toronto's following suit, and it's worked out quite well. So it's a risk, but there could be reward as well. But it's just where are we comfortable with that risk profile? Is there any more to the presentation? Oh,
To your point, Mayor Petrie, we are getting updated costing on the MERC right now from the engineers. And as part of that costing, Michael alluded to pairing it out so you can see what each piece costs. But that updated costing will also have the green technology. These are some of the things that are being tried in the industry today. This is what it would cost to add that component to the MERC so that council is aware of all of the options available to them and what their costs would be.
And that's really what you would need. You need a fulsome report. And I apologize, this isn't meant to be, this is a crappy report if it's a fulsome report. So it's really meant to be a high level, just let's start talking about it, right? So because you really, you know, this is big decisions, big dollars. You don't need pieces of the puzzle. You need the whole thing to look at it and decide how you're going to proceed. So that's the only fair way to treat you.
Mayor Petrie, if I may.
absolutely. Councilor Gutmassen.
So I have more of a comment than anything else. I think we need to give kudos to the committee that really started this all way back, the MERC, the whole process that we were on prior to COVID, and really thank them for getting us onto the path that we have been on. It's been kind of put on hold for a bit, and that's okay. We did apply for funding, but we didn't get it. And I have been on council the longest. I have wanted a MERC since the beginning. So 16 years that I have campaigned in wanting a MERC. I will be the biggest proponent at the table for wanting this MERC in this term. However, not on the taxpayers' dollar. We have to take and have 3 for $1. We need to be putting all of our heads together to try to bring this to fruition. And it cannot be at that 17% by ourselves. I will refuse to allow that to happen in our community. I was around for the 10% increase and felt that on my shoulders. I would never ask a community to take on 17% for something that not the entire community uses. I will echo what Kyle has talked about, that this is what he's talking about for our current arena. I pray that it never happens. Kyle, you just keep doing what you're doing. I don't want to see any reports coming forward that we need to have something being done for this arena. We've managed to stay away from it. Thank you. I hate talking about it even, to be honest with you. Because I think that we're kind of putting those feelers out there that we want it to happen. We don't want to see any of that happen. But we really need to, I think, Mayor Petrie, if you were to forward the information from the MERC committee over to our new members of council, I think it would give them a background as to exactly what was talked about, because we had very good discussions around the table. I think yourself and myself, I'm not sure if Councillor Bowman or Councillor Hughes was a part of any of those meetings, but they were very good discussions, and we had all walks of life at that table. We had the entire community represented at that table. Maybe some of it has changed, but I don't believe that it's really changed that great. And I think that if our newer members of council really receive that information, it will help them to understand it as well. And then with a more fulsome report coming from Kyle and Michael, I do believe that that will help us to make those decisions that we need to do going forward. So, again, sorry for rambling, but I'm by myself, so I get to ramble. Sorry.
Not a problem. I don't have ability to cut you off, so. They didn't include that button.
I'm really glad that they didn't.
Okay, so that finishes that report, does it?
That's right.
Perfect. If there's no more questions or comments?
Just one
Yep, absolutely.
more quick question. So when it comes time to present some options to council, which will hopefully include some green options, will it also cost out the comparison in operating costs? Because I feel like it's important for us to understand, some might have a bigger upfront cost, but be significantly less expensive to operate.
Yeah, we could analyze that, yeah, give you some.
I understand that's a lot more work, so I
No, that's fair,
appreciate,
though,
but that's
because
important
there is a
information.
reward to that, right? So it is, yeah. And then, but maybe just before, that also dovetails with, if you're doing more and you're generating more revenue, you got a lot more chance of being successful in the revenue if you're lowering your operating costs, right? So even though the capital cost is a big thing to deal with, if you can deal with it, you've solved a huge problem. You've solved a problem, you are maybe lowering your operating costs. You are creating a facility that a number of people are going to use. You are going to be a driver for people to come to the community. You are solving a problem, a hole in your asset management plan. So it's a big problem, but as the mayor just pointed out, there's risks and rewards there, right? So there's big rewards too, if done well.
And my hope is, when I say that the engineer's working on options right now and identifying what the green options are, what I've told them is that we get a fulsome report that says, what is our return on investment? So sure, it may be $3 million to add on geothermal, but what would our return on investment be? How much would it lower our operating costs? So that council can have all of that information available to them, so that you can see over the life expectancy over the entire length of the facility. Yes, initially some of these things are more expensive, but over the lifespan of the facility, they actually reduce their cost to then make the facility more viable.
Perfect. And I think the biggest example, we've done this before. We have our pool complex. We've seen what happened. Capital was what, 1.5 million for that. What's our operating cost every year? It's just close to $1 million now, and we've had to invest a lot of money into that. Because time and consideration wasn't given into, there were some visual aesthetics that were added that drastically increased the operational and repair cost of that facility. So these are all things that I know staff are thinking about, and we as council need to think about as well with a new facility. What's our life cycle cost? What's the true cost of having this and ownership over time? Because the capital cost is why the provincial and federal government give money, because that's the cheap part. Your operating cost only goes up. It never goes down, so we'll have to think about that. With that, if there is no more questions or comments, I will ask for Councillor Hudson, please, for a resolution on this.
Moved by myself, Councillor Hudson, seconded by Councillor Van Kooten-Bosson, that the Council of the Corporation of the Town of Ingersoll receive the multi-use recreational facility orientation presentation as information.
Discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. I'm going to ask for a 7-minute recess. No.
That was a
Thank
lot
you.
of me talking, so you probably need a break, so.
Well, we can have more here now. Excellent, welcome back. We are now moving on to the Treasury presentation, and that's why Irina has joined us at the lectern. It's not a podium. There's a good lesson for you. A podium is something you stand on, and a lectern is something you speak at. So. Steve Paikin taught me that.
Going to lecture you then. Okay, so thank you. Lecture you.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I prepared orientation for council about the Treasury and Finance Department. So try to move through the presentation quickly because finance is always a boring topic. But if you have any questions, you can stop me anytime, or you can wait till the end of the presentation, and I will be more than happy to address your questions. So Finance Department. So first is role of the financial officer. It's governed by the Municipal Act. I know we have touched on it during the first orientation session at the Elmhurst, but here's what I should be doing as a financial officer of the municipality: collect money, deposit money, pay all debt of the municipality and other expenditures, maintain accurate records and accounts of financial affairs, provide council with information on financial affairs, and ensures investments are compliant with municipal law. I would like to introduce our finance department to council. So it consists of 4 people. Director of Finance is me. Tax collector and accounts receivable administrator, Mandy Clark. We also have payroll administrator, is our newest addition to the team. She just started in December, Christine Book, and accounts payable, Demilare Bula. So the finance team is fairly new. I'm the longest member of the finance team, but the rest, Mandy, she started in February. Christine, as I said, in December, and Demilare, he started in June. So the team is fairly new. But they are amazing and very qualified. Okay, so what are the responsibility of the finance department? So we provide accounting services. Again, it's reporting, accounts receivable, accounts payable. We're also responsible for payroll, including pension and benefits administration. The finance department is, we oversee asset management as well as the plan and also accounting for our assets in terms of financial reporting. We look after the property taxation, assessments, collection of development charges, and management of securities, because we do receive quite a bit of securities from the developers. Internal controls, we manage through written procedures, annual audits, and segregation of duties. Finance department is also responsible for management, organization, and administration of a town-wide procurement policy. So everything goes through the finance department, and I know the directors are very, very responsible in that regard, and they always contact the finance department to ensure it's in compliance, whatever they're going to do in compliance with our purchasing policy. And of course, annual budgets, annual audits. We also oversee reserve funds, banking services, cash handling, and debt. And we also provide services to every department of the municipality. We are like true support in terms of research or financial modeling. We're always open to help out. So part of our responsibility is producing reports. So we report to council on monthly and quarterly basis. So monthly is our just monthly reports, and quarterly we present variance analysis reports. It's actual to budget reporting. We also prepare financial statements and financial information returns, annual development charges statements, broader public sector energy reports, annual council remuneration reports, public sector salary disclosures, and various reporting for grants. Every grant we receive, we have to report back. So sometimes a $5,000 grant would cost us probably $5,000 in wages just to report. But not complaining, that's what we have to do. And so what council should expect from the finance department is well-organized and timely council reports, and sufficient and timely information and analysis to support council decision-making. We also provide advice and recommendations on policy decisions and notify council of any relevant changes to legislations or programs. And the budget is one of the main responsibility finance department and council has. So we are currently in budget season. We'll start it in early December. January. We'll start bringing draft budget for council consideration. So just to give you a little bit of heads up. Budgets have to be balanced. So we cannot finance operation with debt. We can finance capital budget, but not operation with debt. So we prepare operating and capital budget. So operating budget, we prepare an annual budget. Capital, we present a 10-year forecast for council consideration. So balancing the budget, I know you probably already know, but I thought I would repeat it again. So we start with operating expenditures, so what we need to operate the municipality and provide services. Then we subtract any non-property tax related revenues like user fees, any other service charges, grants we receive from various levels of government, and what's left to balance the budget will be our tax levy requirement. Then we get our assessment, divide the tax levy by the municipal assessment, and that's how we calculate tax rates. There is also another component to calculating tax rates. It's tax ratios. As you know, different property classes are taxed at different ratios. So the tax ratios is upper tier responsibility. So they review and approve the ratios annually through the property tax policy. So usually the county reviews the policy in March. So once they approve the policy, we can then pass our tax rate bylaw.
Just to spend a few more seconds on that, that's a really important slide to understand. We set the tax rate for the municipalities. There's two things on your tax bill when you get it. One is your impact assessment and one is the tax rate. So it can be confusing. Our levy can go up, but our tax rate can go down. Depends how much assessment is out there in the community. So as we grow, there's more assessment, there's more ways to spread it around. So even last year, our levy went up, but our tax rate went down. So really, we need to do a better job, and we talked to Michael about this as well. I was gonna have a county budget meeting, and there were still questions from county councilors about that system and the average tax impact and stuff to an average property. But really, it varies so much the amount of your properties that it's really about the tax rate in your class, if it's going up or down. And that's really what we control. The tax levy, like Irina said, is just the shortfall from revenues. And that can go up significantly, as it did with our last budget with the boundary adjustment. But really, the tax rate went down because our need to funding was lower through levy. So that's the one that's the hardest, I find, to get your head around, is that, and especially in the community, people will hear the media will say, well, the tax levy's going up. But really, we can charge less because there's more people, and there may be other reasons for that levy going up. but the tax rate going down, so.
Yes, so the tax levy can go up, but the burden on a particular, on an average home could be less just because of the increased assessment.
The other thing we haven't seen is impact has not changed the assessed value of houses since 2016. I think if people knew more about the situation, they'd be on the government to do that, because some people are paying too much, some people are paying, you don't know if you're paying the correct amount on your property. So I don't know, they've still frozen it this year, correct?
Yes, that was my next.
Oh, sorry.
slide.
Yeah, there you go. Good timing.
Yes, so property assessment. So property assessments are determined by MPAC. So municipalities have nothing to do with property assessments. So MPAC usually assesses properties every 4 years and then phases it over a 4-year period. So the province has been postponing the reassessment because of COVID. It started because of the pandemic, but I don't know why this year they again postponed the 2022 assessment. I believe because next year will be like 8 years. So they will start fresh, like next 4 years. So basically the values, the 2023 values will be the same as 2022 values, as 2021 values. Basically, that's what's happening. So 2024 will be a big year and will be a lot of anxious property owners because they will be waiting for that new assessment. But to compensate for that, our tax rates most likely will go down because we will need just same amount of money to operate. Like I said, our budget is based on our expenditures, not how much revenue we can collect, what we need to operate. And looking at our Ingersoll assessment, you will see that residential property classes, so it's residential and multi-res, accounts for almost 80% of our assessment. And then, of course, commercial industrial is another 20. We have a little bit of farmland, which was brought in through the recent boundary adjustment. Before that, I believe we had like pretty much non-existent farmlands. Now we do have a little bit. So that's how our assessment looks like. However, the tax burden is a little bit different because of the ratios. As you can see that even the residential properties account for 80% of assessment, they contribute 65% of the property taxation, and the rest is divided between commercial and industrial. In Ingersoll is not unique, but we're one of the few municipalities with high industrial assessment base, just because of the CAMI. It will be increasing because we are growing. Our industrial assessment will grow, which is great because they pay almost 3 times what the residential properties pay. So it's very, very advantageous to have that assessment in municipalities, yes. So looking at 2022 levy distribution, this is just to prepare council a little bit for the budget deliberation. So where do we spend our tax dollars? As you can see that parks in arena, 22% goes to our wonderful recreational facility and parks and trails. Protection services, that includes 25%, significant amount, but it includes policing, which we pay OPP, we contract OPP to provide the policing services in the municipality. It includes our fire protection services, and also building department is in the same category, and property bylaw is in the same category. And engineering services 15%, corporate and council 23%. Again, corporate means everything, finance, IT, clerks, and so on. And how do we fund all these areas, all these services we provide is tax levy. Pretty much tax levy, it's 81%. we are very dependent on that. And user fees and service charges account for only 6%. So we definitely can, there is some work to do in that area we could potentially explore. Asset management, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know we've told Michael had a wonderful presentation, so he explained it very well. All I would like to point out that we will be, we're working on an asset management plan every year. It's a living document that is revised, reviewed, used every year. So we are going to open it up again in March, actually in January. We will review and update it for, hopefully we'll have an update by the mid-2023. So I'll just scroll through. I would like to point, just to bring council's attention to financial strategy, because this is important and will be included in the 2023 budget. So we presented the updated asset management in June of this year. At that time, council approved our financial strategy to fund the infrastructure gap we have currently, funding gap. So the annual infrastructure funding gap was estimated at $2.8 million. So the staff recommended a strategy to address the gap, and the strategy was to increase our taxation levy by approximately 1.5% annually over the next 10 years. So we will close the gap by 2032. So that's the plan, and hopefully we will present the actual numbers, what it looks like during the budget deliberation. And as I said, asset management is a living document. It can be changed every year. We can review our financial strategy on an annual basis. Okay, so debt, this is another area we are paying attention to and trying to minimize the exposure to debt, as how much debt we carry. So currently outstanding debt we're projecting at the end of the year is at $1.7 million. It's not a high debt compared to other municipalities. For example, Tillsonburg, I believe Michael showed us, was at $13 million. So we are, in comparison, are in really, really good position here. So there is no new debt projected for 2022 fiscal year. And our debt servicing cost is about 4% of our own source revenues, that being pretty much taxation and user fees. And we can go as high as 25% of our own source revenues. So currently we're at 4%. As you can see, the debt is just another visual. So if we don't issue any debt, we will be debt-free by 2032. But you can see the debt, it will be diminishing quite significantly. But with the Merck, I don't think it's a really realistic view, but that's what it is as of today.
Irina, can you just expand on the debt repayment and the reason why it takes so long to pay down the debt? We can't pay off debt whenever we want. It's a debenture.
No, we actually don't really issue debt. It's all done by the upper tier. So they are locked into like agreements with the funding sources, so we can't really repay that. We will probably incur quite significant penalties if we do that.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we just can't pay off the debt this year and be done with it. That's always a question that comes up. We have to follow the schedule. In other words, it's more costly.
Yes, it would be more costly. The penalties will cost us quite a bit of money. So reserves and reserve funds. So we all know about the importance of reserves and why they're critical. And you can read it, so I'm not going to read the slide. What I would like to just point out that we have 3 types of reserves here at Ingersoll. Just reserves, for example, winter maintenance, we have a finance reserve or tax stabilization reserve or election reserve. So generally, we use this reserve to cover some operating costs and mitigate fluctuations in operating costs and revenues. And these reserves are established at the direction of council, and they are established to fund programs or special projects. The interest is not allocated to these reserves. It flows through the general surplus. We also have discretionary reserves. So these reserves are segregated from the general reserves of the town, and they are more tailored for the future expenditures or to provide for specific contingent liabilities. For example, the arena reserve, the Merck reserve we have, or we also have public buildings reserves that are specific, that were set up for if something happens with the buildings, we have it so we can address the needs and repair needs of these facilities. We also, and the interest is also not allocated to these reserves, but obligatory reserves, it's development charges reserves. These funds are set directly and directed by provincial or federal regulations, like the development charges reserve funds, and they are set for specific purpose, and they are segregated from the general funds of the municipality. They are actually safeguarded in a special bank account, so all interest is allocated to these reserves. So we can, and council, so for example, development charges, we can't just go and start spending development charges. It has to be in accordance with the development charges study and with the projects that were identified in the development charges study. So it's very, very highly regulated.
Just a couple of quick questions on this. With the development reserve, development charge reserve, would we be able to, sorry, I'll ask this question first. Who determines what that can be spent on? Is it council or is it directive from the province or from the feds?
The projects are determined by municipality, by staff, based on our development needs.
Okay, so,
And these projects, yes, so, and the projects are related to growth, so we can't really say, oh, we need a new arena or
that's where I was going.
a new car. No, it has to be driven by growth. So for example, for the Merck, we do have a little bit of money in our development charges reserve fund, but it's only for the purchase of the land for the second ice pad.
Okay.
So if we were to build one ice pad and purchase the land, we can't draw the money from this reserve fund because they have been allocated for that specific purpose.
I see. Is that,
The rules around development charges, of course, are getting much stricter, but that was the intent of development charges, is supposed to be for growth-related only, so there were very strict rules on how you apply those, because we already have one ice pad. We
Right.
can't, we're not,
Gotcha.
if we didn't have an ice pad, we might be able to use it for some of the additional services, like walking track or something like that, because those were, no, we still can't use it for that or anything.
good try.
I tried.
Good try.
If anybody would like to fall asleep one night, the development charges study is available on the website. And it's very technical. There is only a couple companies that do them because it is such a technical review of that process. Now, there is some changes that have just been brought in legislation that say that reserve funds have to be, 60% have to be spent in a year, and that has been clarified how that would happen with the current rules in place, but
Yes, I'd like to clarify, not spent, allocated.
allocated, okay.
Yes,
Spent or
so it will
allocated.
just mean more administrative work for me to allocate.
Sorry, that was something I was going to bring up earlier. The county has now looking at hiring an extra person just because they've gone from 96 reports, and I say an average of 100 reports, and then with all the legislative changes, now it's an average of 200 reports per year. Are you seeing the same trend?
Of course.
Well, no, and it's a serious question to bring up.
I don't have as many, county has their own areas, like affordable housing,
Yeah.
so we don't have to deal with that. So of course, I don't have 100 reports, but we have quite a significant amount of reporting.
No, and as Deputy Mayor Wilson had brought up, that when we're searching for budget, of course, these are implications that come down of we get decreased funding but increased reports and workload to be put on. It seems to be a trend of we're not going to give you any money, but we're going to tell you what to do, and we want to know what you're doing with it. So it's a concern. It's going to be going forward of when that tipping point is where there's not enough staff to be able to meet the workload that's required, and I trust staff to bring that forward when needed, but it's just a thought that's out there. All these changes that are happening come with increased reporting, and it's a burden that's put on our staff to be able to put that through, so someone can not read it, I guess.
Well, it is a lot of reporting, a lot of work. Even, remember, like at the last council meeting, we talked about the $5,000 grant from Municipal of Transportation. So I received reports, and oh my God, it's a lot of reporting for $5,000, which we can't really spend because we don't have anything in terms of COVID, yes, so, but I still have to do the reporting, even though we don't really need the funds because we have nowhere to spend them. We don't operate transportation, but they still expect us to report, so they can determine whether or not we need the funds.
This is a common thing. Councillor Bowman will recognize CMOG funding for the museum. We get, again, like $5,000 funding a year, and it literally takes staff more time because they went through the process, and I don't know whether someone needed another job at the province, but they literally, the requirements that they ask for that funding and the type of reports for a community museum, you would think that it was like the top museum in all of Canada, and the funding literally took longer staff time than it is worth getting the grant. And I don't know if that's a goal of the province to stop people from applying, but the workload every year goes up, and what we get, the feedback we get from the province is not right there. But, so that's a trend we're seeing again, is just that increase in workload.
Increase of reporting, yes. We will deal with that, we will. Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Yes, as the reports come, we may come to council with some additional requests for staffing, because currently, I used to have deputy treasurer, she retired, so we reorganized the department a little bit because she was actually, not surprised, I'm not surprised, I know she worked really hard and had a lot on her plate, but it was very, very difficult, if not impossible, to replace her with just one position. So we reorganized the department a little bit. So I'm carrying a little more responsibilities, just day-to-day stuff, what she used to do. So I think for 2023, we will be fine, but then going forward, we might reevaluate the composition of the finance department. Okay, and that's where we are with our reserve and reserve funds. As you can see, we have been steadily building our reserves over the last 9 years. There is a little bit of a decrease in 2021, but it is related to the servicing of our industrial lands, so we had to dip in. So we sold the lands, we will replenish that reserve fund with the proceeds from sale. And that concludes my presentation. So as I promised, I wasn't gonna keep you too long. And if you have any questions,
Just a question, the interest allocated to operating from the two types of reserve funds, is that because it's like municipally mandated that that's how the interest has to be used, or just a decision that was made to use that as, in the
Well,
operating budget?
It's not mandated that the only part mandated is the obligatory reserve funds, and we have to allocate interest. For general and discretionary reserve funds, we don't have to allocate interest, and it has been done like that over the years. If council would like to change that process, we can revise our policy to include the interest allocation, even though it will add more reporting.
Well, we've had those discussions in the past, and the answer was that, well, if we put that money there, it's if we don't put the money in the reserve, then next year we got to add that much more to the reserve. So it's kind of one of those things of you get the money now, but then you got to put it back later.
Yes, and again, from the last meeting of council, the surplus we usually allocate to reserves, so eventually money end up there, unless we're on a deficit. It hasn't happened in 8 years I have been working for the town, and we don't anticipate it happening, hopefully.
Back to the asset management plan financial strategy. So we agreed back in, I think it was April of this year, that it would be a 1.5% over the next 10 years. And that is, so basically, we're starting, even if we come with a 0% for operating and for capital, we still have a 1.5% increase.
Yes, that's correct.
Although that could be potentially tempered by growth, right? So it would depend on.
Yes, yes.
I see, right.
Not a 1.5 to tax rate, to levy.
To the levy, yes. Yes. And during, I believe I did bring that up at the time, that we will mitigate that with growth and with exploring other sources of revenue. So we will try to.
That was our intention all along, is that we expect our growth to be more than 1.5%. So we're really kind of allocating that growth to asset management. So it's an easy one to, and with a little luck, it's even more than 1.5%. So, and just like in the asset management slide, or sorry, the Merck slide deck that I did, that growth would also offset those, if you were talking about 17%, well, that growth might offset some of that too, right? So.
Councilor Van Koonbosses, do you have any questions or comments?
No, I do not. Thank you very much, Mayor Petrie.
You're welcome. I just didn't want to leave you out there. Any other comments or questions on the report? Seeing none, then I will call upon Councilor Van Koonbosses for a motion, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. Moved by myself, Councillor Van Koonbosses, and seconded by Deputy Mayor Wilson, that the Council of the Corporation of the Town of Ingersoll receives the Treasury Department orientation presentation as information.
Discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And we will now move on to Fire Department, please. Oh, no, Community Services, sorry. Yeah? Okay, so I've heard that this report may take a while, so it's at council's discretion. I'll take a straw poll of who would like to continue and who would like to call it an evening. Evening? Perfect. Then, with that, sorry, Kyle, I know you're raring to go there.
Burst your bubble, didn't we?
I will thank staff for their presentations. I apologize to those who did not get a chance, but you will be welcome to come back for another evening. I will then ask for an adjournment of the meeting from Deputy Mayor Wilson, please.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Bowman, that the Council of the Corporation of the Town of Ingersoll adjourns the December 19th, 2022 special meeting of council at 8:46 p.m.
Discussion. All those in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Thank you, everyone. I hope it was informative.
So what do we do about this if we didn't finish?
It'll be, we'll have another meeting to go through the rest of it.
Oh, okay, well, somebody else let us know.
Poll, see what's best for the rest of it. For everyone. Set another meeting.
Gotcha.
It'd be another couple hours.